We've got a full panel coming up next, and so we're going to begin the proceedings while you finish lunch. And to get started, first of all, I want to thank the practice groups and each of the leaders who put time and effort into planning this event. It's an incredibly important subject. I also want to thank Dean Reuter for spearheading it for the Federalist Society. And if you join me in giving all of them a round of applause. The topic for our luncheon panel is the role of the coordinate branches in our system of divided power, dealing with this question of the executive branch and executive branch overreach. We've got a great panel of people who have practiced and taught in this area, and I'm excited about their presentations. The format will be, we've asked each of them to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. We'll have a microphone stand over by the door, so if you do have a question, we ask you to go and use the microphone because we are taping this session and hope to be able to use it in other forums. The first presenter is Professor Naomi Rao at George Mason University Law School. She teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and legislation. Those are her main interests in research. She's been focusing on this question of the executive branch and, in particular, the role of the judiciary in supervising the use by the executive branch of its authority. And so, without further ado, let me bring Naomi to the microphone.
Thank you so much to Dean and to the Federal Society for having me on this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the possible judicial constraints that may be possible on the executive branch. Now, sort of the premise of this whole conference, and a fairly commonplace observation, is that we live in an era of very widespread executive branch lawmaking. Agencies operate under broad delegations, and they regularly exercise rulemaking authority that is virtually indistinguishable from the legislative function. Now, the judiciary has, on the whole, placed very few checks on this expansion of administrative power. Perhaps around the margins they've done this, but generally not so much. And so today, I want to question one of the conventional assumptions behind the court's jurisprudence, an assumption that provides a mostly implicit foundation for the court's framework with respect to administration. And that assumption is that when Congress delegates authority to the executive branch, it is a self-denying power, right? It's this idea that when Congress acts against its interests because it is giving up power to its rival, the executive branch. And so since the founding, the court has been very reluctant to police excessive delegations. They continue to recognize concerns about the non-delegation doctrine and the idea that lawmaking power should be vested exclusively with Congress. But in reality, there has been a fair amount of delegation of this policy-making power. And in part, an important understanding behind this is the Madisonian view, right? Legislative delegation should in part be a classic case of ambition counteracting ambition. You know, in this idea, Congress will jealously guard its lawmaking power and not yield too much to the executive, right? It's this formal view that Congress gives up power and the president takes the power. And if that's the case, then political checks and balances should be enough to prevent excessive delegations. Or at least that's largely the assumption that the court has operated under. I think it's also possible to understand the Chevron framework of deference in light of this conventional assumption. You know, Chevron in many ways is a pro-delegation decision. And Justice Scalia, in particular, has emphasized that if Congress is going to delegate its power, then it must give up that power to either the courts or the executive branch. And so it sort of forces the rivalry, right? If a delegation of authority gives Congress the power to fill in the gaps, to interpret ambiguities, then that may bolster this rivalry, right? It may cause Congress to protect its powers. Now, of course, the court's jurisprudence in both of these areas rests on a number of different grounds, and I'm not suggesting this is the only ground, but I am suggesting that the formal, conventional view that Congress gives up power when it delegates is an important assumption behind a lot of the court's decisions. And it's an assumption that allows for open-ended delegations, and it's an assumption that encourages a fair measure of deference to executive branch agencies. And so today what I want to propose is a reconsideration of that conventional view, a reconsideration of the view that delegation is in fact a self-denying power. And I want to highlight briefly how Congress can benefit from delegations in a variety of ways. And these benefits have been documented in the political science literature and the economics literature, but it's not something that the court has generally recognized. They've continued to take a fairly formal view of how Congress exercises its powers. But the reality of congressional power, I think, is quite different. So let's consider just some of the potential benefits that Congress might be able to realize. Perhaps most significantly, Congress can reduce the costs of legislating when it delegates authority to the executive branch. As we all know, it's extremely difficult to pass statutes, right? This is a conscious part of our constitutional design. Article 1, Section 7 raises a lot of hurdles to lawmaking. And the more specific and detailed a statute needs to be in our complex regulatory state, of course, the harder it will be to reach agreement across a legislative majority. Not only that, the conventional view assumes that lawmakers are primarily interested in making law. But of course, lots of observations of Congress suggest that they may be trying to maximize other things, like re-election. And delegating authority to executive branch agencies frees up time for those other non-legislative activities. So another benefit, so delegation reduces all of these costs of lawmaking. Delegation may also make it easier for Congress to provide private goods to special interests. There's a lot of research that suggests delegations make it easier to give goods to particular groups and then disperse costs across society, right? So this is the idea that delegation will enable Congress to satisfy private groups at a greater rate. And of course, another benefit that Congress realizes from delegation is that it can claim credit for solving a regulatory problem and then perhaps shift the costs of that solution and the costs of the regulation to the agencies. Now, this is just a very brief synopsis of some of the benefits, and there's a lot of dispute about how and when Congress can realize these benefits. But I think it's fairly clear that Congress does realize a lot of benefits from delegation. I also think it's an intuitively plausible idea that they realize these benefits. And so importantly, if Congress is realizing these benefits, I think it's fair to see that delegation provides a kind of power for Congress. It's not necessarily a self-denying giving up of their authority. Instead, it's a way in which it's a mechanism they have for legislating, right? When otherwise a more specific statute would be too costly or even perhaps impossible to pass. Now, admittedly, delegations, of course, also give a lot of power over to the executive, right? No one is questioning that. But I think it turns out that control over administration is often not a zero-sum game for the political branches, right? They both benefit from delegations. And so we already are quite aware, I think, both courts and commentators and observers of the administrative state, that delegations have expanded dramatically the power of the executive branch. But if delegations also enhance the power of Congress, then the structural checks of separation of powers will fail. Right? Ambition will not counteract ambition because in part the ambitions of the two branches will point in the same direction with respect to overly broad delegations. And it follows from this that the political process will not provide a check, right? It will not provide a check on these delegations. And we've seen in other contexts that the court, when political checks have failed, the judiciary has often stepped in to enforce the balance of power and to enforce the limits on government as a whole. And so maybe this more realistic understanding of Congress's power should suggest a reconsideration of the court's doctrines in these areas. And I guess I would say that the court has acknowledged a more realistic view of the operation of executive power in administration. There's lots of recognition in the opinions about the vast administrative state and the problems of accountability in the administrative state. Right, Chief Justice Roberts recently said in the Free Enterprise Fund case, he said, "Our Constitution was adopted to enable the people to govern themselves through their elected leaders. The growth of the executive branch, which now wields vast power and touches almost every aspect of daily life, heightens the concern that it may slip from the executive's control and thus from that of the people." And we can see a realistic view in some other opinions as well, right? Justice Scalia's dissenting opinion in Morrison v. Olson about the independent counsel, or Justice Jackson's famous concurrence in the Youngstown Steel case, right? These are opinions that all take a very realistic understanding of how executive power and executive discretion operate. So I think it's possible for the court to take a more realistic understanding of congressional power and what Congress stands to realize from these delegations. Of course, recognizing this more realistic view of congressional power raises perhaps a harder question, which is how should courts take this into account? How should they adjust the doctrine to account for this factor? And, well, here I think I will offer only a few tentative suggestions, because I do think this is a difficult question. But one possibility might be that if delegations are an aggrandizing power of Congress, and then courts perhaps should reconsider their refusal to enforce the non-delegation doctrine. Right? If delegations are an assertion of congressional power, then maybe stronger judicial review is warranted. And this would be in line with other cases in which the court has recognized that congressional aggrandizement poses a problem for separation of powers. Now, of course, delegations are different because they're not just encroaching on the power of the executive, they are giving power to the executive. But of course, that may just make the separation of powers a lot worse, right? You have the two branches working together to circumvent limits on the constitutional structure. But of course, commentators and individual justices have issued periodic calls for reviving the non-delegation doctrine, and they've generally gone nowhere, so I'm not very optimistic about that. But even if courts aren't going to more directly enforce the non-delegation doctrine, maybe a recognition of congressional power in this area should encourage them to take non-delegation concerns more seriously in statutory interpretation. Now, the court already does this, but perhaps it could do it in a more robust way. And maybe the court in general should be less afraid of line drawing if it believes that delegation expands the power of both of the branches and doesn't just expand the power of the executive. So I mentioned that the conventional view of delegation also exists behind is one perhaps understanding of the Chevron framework for deference, the Chevron Meade City of Arlington framework for deference. But if the conventional view is mistaken, and if delegations expand congressional power, then perhaps the deference frameworks need to be reconsidered as well. I'm not sure precisely how this should work, but you might want to start with Chief Justice Roberts' dissenting opinion in City of Arlington, to suggest that courts should at least enforce the boundaries of agency jurisdiction and not defer to agencies with respect to their own jurisdiction. Right? If the agency doesn't have delegated authority, then there should be no basis for deference. Okay, so just to wrap up, I've suggested that courts should take a more realistic view of the operation of power of congressional delegations. And in part, that's because in the expansive administrative state, Congress can't really keep up with executive branch lawmaking. To continue legislating, to continue to remain relevant, they have to delegate. And so delegating expands their power, even as it confers more power on the executive to administer those laws. And so I think that this idea that both political branches benefit from delegations suggests a reason for reconsidering the court's work in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Our next presenter is someone we know well, Chuck Cooper, former Assistant Attorney General at OLC and founding partner of Cooper Kirk law firm and one of the premier litigators of several of the most important Supreme Court cases in recent history. Chuck.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be with you this afternoon, especially among such esteemed panel members here from academia. As David mentioned, I was privileged to serve as the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Reagan administration under Attorney General Edwin Meese. One of the principal responsibilities of that office is to jealously protect the constitutional prerogatives of the president against encroachment by Congress. So make no mistake, I am an unapologetic advocate of robust executive power, and I believe that every president has the right and the responsibility to exercise his constitutional powers in full measure, to the full extent of Article II's limits. But it's also the peculiar responsibility of OLC to counsel the president objectively and honestly on the limits of his powers. And it's the president's constitutional obligation, secured by his oath of office, to respect those limits. That is among a president's most important but difficult things to do. The framers understood this very well. They understood that men are not angels, and that therefore ambition must be made to counteract ambition, as Madison put it in number 51. And so they equipped each branch, again, from Madison 51, with the necessary means and personal motives to resist encroachments by the other. Our Constitution and its system of checks and balances has been no match for President Obama. He has, I submit to you, violated his oath of office comprehensively, for he has done that which the Constitution forbids him to do, and he has not done that which the Constitution requires him to do. In the former category, President Obama has responded to Congress's refusal to act certain measures on his legislative agenda by nonetheless unilaterally imposing the rejected measures on the American people as law. And he's made no bones about his usurpation of legislative power. His imperial edicts have often been accompanied by imperious declarations, such as, "I refuse to take no for an answer. Where Congress won't act, I will. We can't wait for an increasingly dysfunctional Congress to do its job. I will act on my own." And most recently, and perhaps famously, "I've got a pen and I've got a phone, and I can use that pen to sign executive orders." About the only claim that the president hasn't made yet is "L'État, c'est moi." Examples of this administration's disregard for the rule of law abound, I submit to you, and they're as varied as the federal bureaucracy itself. And I understand that in the panels that have taken place before us this morning, that many of those abuses have been cataloged. I won't attempt to catalog them here, but I do want to mention two for reasons that will become relevant in a moment. Recalling his own youthful drug abuse, the president not only has suspended federal laws prohibiting the sale of the use of marijuana, he has openly encouraged violation of those laws, even going so far as to provide official guidance to banks on how to provide financial services to marijuana dealers. That's a federal felony. And in perhaps, in my opinion, the most appalling revelation concerning the Obama administration's excesses of executive power, as this panel is entitled, the IRS singled out the president's political opponents for special unfavorable scrutiny under the tax code, a positively Nixonian corruption of the rule of law. President Obama's abuses and usurpations cannot, I don't believe, be dismissed as a lamentable but transient condition from which the rule of law and our country will recover once the administration has run its course. That's not how the natural contest for power works. Today's abuse of power is tomorrow's historical precedent, cited to support the claim that the earlier abuse has become an accepted part of our constitutional tradition. If you doubt this, read the Solicitor General's briefs in the Noel Canning case, defending the constitutionality of the president's recess appointments. The point is that a failure to resist President Obama's repeated serious offenses against the Constitution's separation of powers is not only to suffer the consequences ourselves, but to condemn future generations to suffer them as well. So nothing short of our constitutional order is at stake. But what is Congress? What are we to do about that? Well, the truth is that the framers left us precious few options. They rejected a parliamentary system, opting instead to subject the president to the political discipline of regular and relatively frequent appeals to the people to sustain his tenure in office. But when the 22nd Amendment eliminated the prospect of re-election for a second-term president, it took much of the political discipline with it. Remember President Obama's comment to Medvedev about Europe's missile defense system? It is important for Vladimir to give me some space. This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility. Now, Congress's first line of defense, typically against a lawless administration, is the power of the purse. But the notion that Congress can bring President Obama's excesses to heel by simply defunding the programs or activities that occasion his abuses is met by a number of practical difficulties for which we don't have time this morning to go into. But the most important point I would make on that is that federal programs are designed, at least in theory, to benefit directly American citizens or otherwise to serve their interests. And defunding a program necessarily makes its beneficiaries hostages in any congressional use of the power of the purse to coerce the president. Which brings us to the nuclear option, impeachment. Impeachment is obviously a drastic remedy, mandating, upon conviction of the Senate, removal from office. The threshold question is whether President Obama's serial violations of the separation of powers satisfies the constitutional standard for impeachment. Has he committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, according to the views of a variety of respected constitutional scholars, including ardent supporters of the president, I believe there's little doubt that he has. Consider this statement on the subject by a renowned scholar. High crimes and misdemeanors, as terms of art, must refer to serious abuses of the governmental power with which a public official has been entrusted. Certainly, a president who ordered the government to stop enforcing the laws against marijuana use because he was philosophically opposed to the regulation of marijuana or because he was widely known to have used it as a youth, would have committed an impeachable high crime or misdemeanor of the most dramatic sort by shredding his obligation to execute the laws of the country. Now, these are Professor Larry Tribe's words, written in opposition to the charge that President Clinton had committed impeachable offenses in connection with his private affairs, so to speak. To the same effect are the views of Professor Cass Sunstein, who's a former top official in the Obama White House and currently a professor at the Harvard Law School. He also testified in the Clinton impeachment hearings, and he said that the ordinary predicate for impeachment is an act by the president that amounts to a large-scale abuse of distinctly presidential authority. For example, using the IRS to punish political opponents would constitute conduct that by itself raises serious questions about abuse of office. Well, indeed it does. Recall that the second article of impeachment against President Nixon included this charge. He has, acting personally and through his subordinates and agents, endeavored to cause, in violation of the constitutional right of citizens, income tax audits and other income tax investigations to be initiated or conducted in a discriminatory manner. But the impeachment of a president is a grave step, to say the least. Not only is its explicit purpose to legislatively overturn the sovereign judgment of the people at the ballot box, its impact on the work of the government and on our domestic tranquility is deeply corrosive. Of course, these costs, high as they are, must nonetheless be endured if impeachment is the only way to protect the Constitution and the rule of law. There is, however, another option I would submit, short of impeachment, for indicting the president's unconstitutional conduct in office. The House of Representatives can, and I believe should, prepare, debate, and adopt a unicameral resolution identifying and condemning President Obama's usurpations of legislative power and his refusals to faithfully execute the laws of the land. The Congressional Research Service has identified a number of historical precedents in which the Senate or the House has adopted a resolution of censure or disapproval of a president or other executive or judicial officers. Indeed, in 1998, Senator Dianne Feinstein and 37 co-sponsors introduced a joint resolution in the Senate that recounted President Clinton's various misdeeds and not only condemned his wrongful conduct in office in the strongest terms, reading from the resolution, but also censured the president personally. Likewise, Representative Nancy Pelosi and other Democratic members of the House proposed similar resolutions declaring that President Clinton, quote, fully deserves the censure and condemnation of the American people and the Congress. I believe that members of Congress have an obligation rooted in their oaths of office to formally denounce President Obama's train of abuses and usurpations of legislative power. Adoption of a resolution of condemnation would allow the House to perform that service to their country without detonating the I-bomb. It is critical that the historical record of our present constitutional conflict offer no support to the argument that the constitutional validity of President Obama's conduct in office can be judged by the fact that it was met by Congress's silence and thus its acquiescence. The great Senator Henry Clay, offering a Senate resolution denouncing as unconstitutional President Andrew Jackson's acts relating to the Bank of the United States, warned his fellow senators in the language for which he was famous, the premonitory symptoms of despotism are upon us. And if Congress does not apply an instantaneous and effective remedy, the fatal collapse will soon come on, and we shall die, ignobly die, base, mean, and abject slaves, with the scorn and contempt of mankind, unpitied, unwept, and unmourned. Where are Henry Clays? Such a resolution would also serve as a warning, a sort of constitutional yellow card, if you will, that Congress and the American people will not tolerate abuses of powers indefinitely, and that henceforth the president does act at his peril. Again, nothing short of our constitutional order is at stake, I would submit to you. And the one thing that Congress and the American people must not do is do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you. Our final speaker and presenter on this panel is also a frequent speaker at Federalist Society events, Professor Bill Eskridge from Yale Law School, the John Carver law professor there, perhaps best known for his work on jurisprudence in anti-discrimination based on sexual preference and gender. But today we've asked him to speak about legislation and executive overreach.
Well, I'm no Henry Clay, I'm afraid. I'm not even a John C. Calhoun, although I did grow up in the South and in South Carolina. And unfortunately, like Henry Clay, maybe unlike him, I'm pessimistic. I think the problem that the society has laid before us is a bigger problem than President Obama. And in fact, I think it's an intrinsic one in our political system. So I admire Madison. The idea of ambition countering ambition is a great way of thinking about the government because it's structural. But unfortunately, the three branches are not checking one another in the way that Madison would have envisioned. Maybe Hamilton would have, but not Madison. And indeed, I think there's a classic and exacerbating institutional mismatch that makes this problem more intractable. And then I think we're going to defeat efforts at trying to come up with solutions. My specific theme is that the president and the executive branch are today and are growing even more so powerful than the framers expected, maybe apart from Hamilton. And let me just do it in sequence. I think to begin with, the framers established a big advantage for the presidency that we didn't have with Congress and the Supreme Court. The presidency, this is what political scientists have argued for a number of years, has huge, what they call first mover advantages. The president is decisive, unlike the Supreme Court, unlike Congress. The president is the decider, and the president can move swiftly. So for example, in diplomacy, foreign affairs, and military affairs, the president gets to choose his or her battles, gets to make the first move, and then everybody else reacts. Even when the president makes a mistake, the president has a lot of framing power by that first move. Legislative proposals, even the veto power. The president has the option of declaring well in advance, I'm going to stop this piece of legislation by exercising a probable veto power. I'm going to make proposals. And then, as importantly as the other panelists have talked about, the president, even when something is passed, is going to be in charge of implementation, either the president directly or agents appointed by the president, and that's the idea of nomination. Even though the president does not control in detail the bureaucracy, the president does nominate people, and also, more importantly, the president nominates justices on the court. So it's no surprise, Naomi, in your lifetime, presidents have not been nominating people who are sympathetic to Congress. Presidents, on the whole, have been nominating people who are sympathetic to the expansion of presidential power. And then, to invoke the Steele-Seizure case, Justice Jackson, Steele-Seizure case is actually an accordion that supports the president because Justice Jackson's framework gives a roadmap for the president to expand his power through this constitutional adverse possession that Jackson, Frankfurt, and some of the other justices endorsed. So that's a huge advantage to the president. And I don't care whether it's Obama or Bush and Cheney or Clinton or Reagan or Nixon, whoever. Most presidents in the modern era, from FDR on, have skillfully taken advantage of this power, but it's worse than what I'm describing. And that is the first mover advantage that the framers set in motion has been greatly increased by factors utterly unanticipated by the framers. Factors such as the domination of political parties. Framers didn't quite anticipate that. The existence of political parties and the fact that the president is always the head of one of them increases the presidential power by giving the president dogged defenders both on the court and in Congress, even when the president's party does not control the Congress. The media, even though the framers utterly rejected the idea that the president would be like the king, the media has made the president our focal point, and there is a scary similarity between People magazine's coverage of the Obama family and its coverage of the royal family in London. Okay? And then there's the need for speed. The communications and technological resolution have given rise to what I call the Jack Bauer phenomenon, and that is that presidents, and I think it's not just Obama, I think it's the presidents all down the line, see themselves like Jack Bauer. Even when Los Angeles is not on the verge of being blown up, which it is season after season, the president does see him or herself as waking up in the morning and trying to make the world better and the world safer. And if the president thinks there's a bomb out there ticking or a deficit that needs reducing or a program that needs implementing, the president, like Jack Bauer, is not going to slow down too much for the niceties of the rule of law. So it's even worse. It's even worse than what I'm now describing, these new factors. It's even worse today, I think, than it was 15 or 20 years ago, because in addition to the first mover advantage that I think is structural in the office, And in addition to all these technological changes, which I think have made it worse in the 21st century, these advantages are greatly increased by the default among the coordinate branches. In other words, the coordinate branches themselves are not, and for structural reasons, doing their jobs of checking the executive power. So it's a story of torpor, and torpor always begins with Congress. That Congress already, and this was the intent of the framers, has the veto gates structure, which makes it difficult to pass resolutions and legislation, makes it difficult to pass statutes overriding the president, checking the president, etc. But it's even worse in a period of hyper-partisan divisions, which we've had for the last 30 years, where almost every year the division between the Republicans and the Democrats grows sharper, less overlap. It's produced hyper-partisanization in the Congress, which exacerbates the veto gates problem. And even exacerbating it yet further is the higher percentage of members of Congress who see their mission not as passing laws to restrict or expand the president one way or the other, but as obstructing the enactment of laws. It's obstructing Congress's ability to do its traditional job. Now, the result of this, and you might like a lot of the positions that some of the members of the legislature take, because stopping my bill might be good, but I'm going to stop your bill, and that might be not so good. What this means is that Congress is less able to do its traditional legislative services that the framers expected them to do. It's less able to do oversight with bite. It's less able to pass statutes, including overrides of Supreme Court decisions, executive actions. It's less able to do affirmative budgetary restraints through structural deals that create the proper incentives. Now, parallel to, but not nearly as celebrated as, and maybe not as bad as, congressional torpor is judicial torpor. The U.S. Supreme Court today takes fewer cases than at any other point in my lifetime. I can remember, and some of you can remember, in the 70s, when the court would decide 150, 160, 170 cases per year. Now it does not reach the triple digits. Standing and justiciability limitations have gotten more and more stringent, which prevents groups like the Federalist Society and citizens from challenging executive usurpation. And there's even some timidness about making big moves. Every court makes some big moves. There is some worry that a court which has little political capital, as the current one perhaps does, would be even more timid about making big moves. So, my picture is a very negative one indeed about executive power. Is it the case then that the president is utterly unconstrained in our system? Now, I do think the president is not as constrained as the president was even 20 years ago by the Supreme Court and by Congress. And I am not dependent upon specific doctrines. I don't think Chevron makes any difference. I don't think the specific doctrines making a difference. I think it's all structural. So what constraints that exist upon the president, I would suggest, are also structural. And this is what I would see. First, I do think the president, much like the King of England from the 13th through the 18th century, is constrained by the lack of money. True, Congress does have a hard time getting its act together on anything, including budgetary matters. But nonetheless, it is the case that the president does not have unlimited amount of funds. The limitation on funds has limited our foreign engagements, has limited some of the social welfare programs, and has required the chief executive to economize in a world of scarcity. This was true under the Bush and Cheney administration, and it's true also under the Obama and Biden administration. Perhaps more importantly, for the president, particularly for the structural reasons that I've laid out, results do matter. For the same hyper-attention on the president that the media and the telecommunications revolution have created, the president, maybe even more than in the past, is responsible when policies do not work out, even when it's not the president's fault. So George H.W. Bush was blamed for policies that probably he didn't contribute to. And some of the things that he did right, the gains were reaped by President Clinton in a moment of irony. But be that as it may, the president is not only the decider-in-chief, but the president is responsible. The president gets blamed, and the blame does have consequences. So the stories of presidential failure are legion. LBJ, the war in Vietnam. President Ford and President Carter, stagflation. Presidents Clinton and Obama, healthcare. Presidents Bush and Cheney, the financial crisis. The stories of problems and failure and constriction on presidential abilities are legion. And then sometimes, the president messes up royally, to continue my London parallel. Sometimes the president messes up royally, and there is a political opportunity to reclaim some of the seepage that has occurred from the other branches of government to the president. The big mess up, I guess, in my lifetime is probably President Nixon. Though actually he was not impeached. They voted articles of impeachment by the committee. He was not impeached. He was not removed from office. But the whole Nixon collapse of lawlessness and whatnot produced puissance, particularly in Congress, that lasted through much of the mid-1970s, when Congress did reclaim a lot of its lawful authority, and Presidents Ford and Carter lost a massive amount. Now, I do not see either President Obama or his likely successor, whoever that might be, engaging in this kind of Nixonian catastrophe for the presidency. And so I think for the foreseeable future, the aggrandizement of presidential power will probably get worse, particularly if Congress's torpor continues, and if the Supreme Court continues to be as timid, relatively speaking, as it has been. I think we're going to see more, not less, agency dynamism. I think we're going to see more, not less, executive orders. I think we're going to see more, not less, administrative overrides, and not just workarounds, but overrides of Supreme Court statutory interpretation decisions. We're going to see more deployment of information, spying, technology, et cetera, et cetera. We're morphing into a state where maybe the relevant actor is no longer Jack Bauer, but it's instead Mr. Reese and Mr. Finch of the more recent television show Person of Interest. Now, is there anything besides a presidential meltdown that the coordinate branches can do? Here are my suggestions, and some of them will perhaps shock you. I agree with Naomi that the Supreme Court, I do not see the Supreme Court as the major actor. I see it as a peripheral actor. But I do think the Supreme Court can enforce more stringently what I've called these non-delegation canons. There are a whole bunch of canons of statutory interpretation which do enforce through statutory interpretation what they are not willing to enforce anymore and are not going to enforce anymore under the non-delegation doctrine constitutionally. There's some very famous showdowns. The FDA tobacco case, Brown and Williamson in 2000, cutting back the FDA's authority to regulate tobacco, overridden by statute, which is the way it's supposed to work. Oregon and Gonzales, the aid in dying law in Oregon preempted by Attorney General Ashcroft through a directive by him, overridden by the court on non-delegation grounds. Justice Scalia's very famous decision in MCI and AT&T, conservatively interpreting the Communications Act of 1934. I think the bigger move on the part of the Supreme Court would be to trim back its hyper-activist, and I might add unmoored at all in the language or original meaning of Article 3, the justiciability and standing jurisprudence by the Supreme Court. I think the best thing the Supreme Court could do would be to do its job and to return the federal courts to doing their job, which is to hear challenges to usurpative behavior on the part of officials, including agency officials, including White House and presidential officials. And probably much, maybe even most, Chuck, of the lawless behavior you're describing is not justiciable or difficult to find justiciable controversies against such behavior. And much of that is at the feet of the U.S. Supreme Court, a case that Chuck and I very much agree on. We're both critics, for example, of the Chief Justice's outrageously anti-democratic opinion in the Perry case, where the democratic process is overridden by a judicial expansion of Article 3 jurisprudence, which I think has no basis in the original meaning of Article 3 of the Constitution. And indeed, I would go even further and suggest that the judiciary needs to be reinvigorated more generally. We need to stop the stalemate. This is true of both Republicans and Democrats. Stop the stalemate preventing the appointment of federal judges. And I don't care whether they're conservatives or liberals. All I care about is whether they are intelligent. Intelligent Obama and Clinton appointees like Bob Katzmann of New York, and intelligent and capable Republican appointees like Dick Posner and Frank Easterbrook in the Seventh Circuit provide the best deal we get in government today. And we need more of them. And we don't need to be particular and go to nuclear war over whether or not Nina Pillard or Mr. Estrada are going to be on the D.C. Circuit. We need to put all of them on the D.C. Circuit. We need to put all of them on the various courts. And we need to get the courts moving again. Now, my advice on Congress, I really don't know how to solve the torpor that is Congress. I do think that a big check on presidents. Chuck mentioned, I think, very appropriately, the president is term limited. On the other hand, presidents are responsive to elections. And I think that is a tangible limit on presidents. When presidents are rebuked, even in off-term elections, I think that does make a difference. And if, for example, the president, as appears to be likely, is rebuked in a big way in the 2014 elections, I do see that as a moment for congressional reinvigoration. It will not be a congressional reinvigoration if the new Congress is one that engages in shutdowns rather than deals. And I would suggest, for those of you who have any influence in Congress or any influence in the political process, which I have none, in fact, less than none, being a faculty member at the Yale Law School is inversely related to political power or any connection with political power. All right, now maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing. But I think it's not a good thing, but it is an inevitable thing. And part of the point of my remarks is we need to look at realities, and I'm afraid that is one of the deepest realities. And I do think that if Congress is reinvigorated with a strong majority going the other way, they need a more positive project, and they need to make deals. The conservative agenda, I think, advanced a lot more under President Clinton because a Republican Congress made deals with the president, where the president not only sold his own soul, which came very cheap, but the president sold the souls of gay couples, lesbians raising children, our nation's most adulterous president, denouncing committed lesbians raising children. He sold the souls of innocent people on death row. He sold the souls of a lot of different constituent groups, which the Democrats relied on. The Republicans made great deals from the point of view of conservative policies, in my opinion, in the 1990s. Maybe better deals than they made in the new millennium under President Bush. So that's my main suggestion, is that if you want to limit presidential aggrandizement, you need to work through the political process, and you need to reinvigorate Congress in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Please, if anybody, I hope you'll have questions, come over to the mic. I'm going to do the chair's prerogative and lead off with the first question that's a little bit of a comment as well. As a former member of Congress, I want to agree with Chuck and Bill that there's a problem with that branch, and I would suggest a solution there is a procedural one. If they return to regular order, particularly in the appropriations process, there's a chance you can make that power of the purse a more effective tool. And keying off of Bill's example that Congress was able to negotiate with President Clinton better, they had a more regular process that empowered them to reach a consensus that they could then, as a branch, go forward and negotiate with the president. So with that, I guess that really wasn't a question, but a comment on, on the statements that were made. Let me turn to our first questioner.
Naomi, I think you've done a great job identifying the source of the problem, the rejection of the Madisonian assumption. My question, though, is your proposed solution to get the court re-engaged a viable one, since the court may well have a vested interest in seeing the other political branches expand the scope of the federal government as well, because it essentially expands their power too. So it's not just Congress abdicating because it benefits, but maybe the court has abdicated because it benefits as well.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, is this on? I think that's certainly possible and something I didn't really talk about, but I think delegations also expand the power of the courts. So, right, they may not be the best actor. I was asked to sort of say, you know, what the court might be able to do to restrain the administrative state, and I guess I'm not very optimistic that there is a lot they can do. But one way perhaps to get them engaged is to focus on this problem of both of the branches expanding their power. But as you say, they may also lack the incentive to do that, because the expansion of power in Congress and in the executive branch also leaves them more space to interpret and assert their power.
Bill or Chuck, any comments on that?
I think the only point I would add is, John, we see that same phenomenon at work in the court over a long period of time in connection with the other separation of powers, federalism, and with the states having no place to go other than to the Supreme Court, ultimately, hat in hands, seeking to have their sovereign prerogatives as established by the framers upheld and protected and policed. Federalist 39 recognizing that it is the Supreme Court's responsibility to do exactly that, and we've seen, I think, as a result of this very same phenomenon that it has, over the long pull of history, not done that job.
I would only add on the non-delegation doctrine, one of many reasons the court is not going to revive it or enforce it. And notice Justice Scalia and I believe Justice Thomas are not enforcing it either. Yet another reason is the court doesn't have the capacity. We have dozens of unconfirmed positions. Salaries have not been increased measurably in decades. Go to the Supreme Court's website and read the Chief Justice's groveling State of the Budget message to Congress. I'm not kidding. It is groveling. The limited resources that the court system has. This is a great deal for the American taxpayers. And the Chief Justice of the United States ought not to be groveling for money to pay needed personnel. So the courts just simply don't have the capacity to handle a lot of the lawsuits that would generated if the non-delegation doctrine and some of these other doctrines were actually enforced.
If I may, Gene, a follow-up question to that one, and Chuck touched on it briefly. Do any of you see any possibility that the states, as separate from the three branches of the federal government, could play a role in restoring the proper balance or countering Naomi's hypothesized conspiracy to expand federal power? Naomi?
You know, possibly. States are also involved sometimes with the expansion of federal power and realize benefits from it. So perhaps in theory they can provide a check, maybe. I'm not sure how strong that might be.
Chuck?
Oh, well, I think they can, but I don't think they can do it unilaterally or by themselves. They unfortunately are basically consigned to, again, coming to the federal courts and to the Supreme Court. And they did very effectively, or at least in part effectively, in the Obamacare case, when the Supreme Court established what were very surprising, very robust, very unexpected limitations on Congress's power to coerce effectively the sale of state sovereignty with federal money. Which, you know, the limits on that had only been theoretical up until that decision. That was a very important breakthrough, I think, in principles of federalism.
Yeah, I agree with Chuck. I think the Obamacare might end up being a big moment of state resistance. The Chief Justice has created a big loophole, which the states have been capitalizing on. And if Obamacare does get bled to death, I think it'll be from the states, not going along with the Medicaid expansion. On the other hand, I do think the states on immigration and other issues have been agenda entrepreneurs and have challenged, but the Supreme Court has generally agreed with the Obama administration. You know, for the most part, when states come to challenge immigration, preemption, you know, things like that, the states have lost a lot of that. Whether it's the Bush administration or the Obama administration, they come down in favor of, we're going to eliminate state sovereignty on areas of tort, immigration, et cetera. The federal government has usually prevailed at the Supreme Court level.
And certainly in regulatory issues.
Yes, sir.
As well.
Which is most of them. Most of them are not.
Yeah.
Most of them are transportation, energy, cars, drugs, stuff like that. Not the kind of things that make headlines. But those are ultimately more important than some of the big ticket issues that, you know, the New York Times will put on page one.
The friends of federalism and state sovereignty have always and will always be fair weather. They're federalism's friends shifts as the politics dominant in the country shifts, and as the claims of federal preemption emanate from different quarters. That will always be the same.
The experience of the litigator. Gene.
Yeah, I was distressed to see Professor Estridge so depressed, and I want to, or depressed isn't the right word, but unoptimistic. So I want to ask a question to encourage a change in that. You know, it's when we talk about the structural part, we are in talking about what Congress could do. Much though many in this room, perhaps including me, might not like it. The one problem Congress has is, at least in political party terms, it has exactly one of two branches. Does your structural argument hold if you have both houses in the control of the party that's not with the president, even if the president wants to be very aggressive? Can't a determined Congress, which is a tough thing to get, but both houses of a determined Congress, I mean, with the purse strings alone, and there are plenty of other tools too, can't they, at the end of the day, in a straightforward knockdown, drag-out fight, don't they win?
Congress.
Yeah.
Well, I think it depends. It depends on how well organized they are. For all the criticism he gets, I think the Gingrich-Dole Congress of the mid-1990s was very successful in carrying out a conservative agenda against an ideologically flexible, if not flaccid, president, okay? In my opinion, now this is not very popular, but in my opinion, Congress needs to pass statutes. They can be conservative statutes, they can be liberal statutes. Congress has got to pass statutes. And Congress did a lot of that in the mid-1990s. Ironically, what brought that to a close and what actually initiated our 15-year period of torpor was the impeachment of President Clinton. And the big argument against impeachment, I was working with Henry Hyde and Charles Grassley in 1998 on asbestos reform, creating a federal corporation to handle the asbestos cases, which are a huge, ridiculous problem the courts were mismanaging. And we finally had a proposal with bipartisan support, and I've been testifying about it for years, take this out of the courts, put it in something. We had a corporation at that point. It was geared to go. Hyde had his majority. And it was destroyed by the impeachment of President Clinton, because the same committee, the Judiciary Committee in the House and then the one in the Senate that had jurisdiction over this, spent most of 1998, rather than passing this legislation, which was needed, spent going after President Clinton, okay? And then there was a trial in the Senate, and that was foreordained. Not because he was guilty or innocent. It was foreordained because the Democrats had a lot more than 33 votes that could block the necessary removal, okay? So my mantra is you need to pass statutes and fund them or defund them or repeal them, whatever. And so Congress, and to do that, you usually have to make deals. I'm afraid the fact of life, and please, the chair can correct me because I'm less an authority than someone actually served in the legislature. Fact of life is you do not get statutes unless you make deals.
Absolutely.
I'm afraid. Within your own coalition, much less with the people who are opposed or reluctant on you. You've got to make deals. And it's better to have statutes from Congress than to have nothing from Congress. Because when there's nothing from Congress, look, this is the punchline. We have enormous problems in the country. You know, foreign attacks, you know, information leakages, economy limping along. These are problems that need to be addressed somehow. Maybe not by the government. So maybe deregulation is the right answer. But you do not address the problems by paralysis. Because if you do paralysis, then an aggressive and intelligent and decisive agent, i.e. the president and the agencies, will do it for you. Okay? And that's, in my opinion, a fact of life. So yeah, Dean, I didn't tell you that I was depressed. I said I was pessimistic. I'm a political independent. If you're a Democrat and a supporter of President, I think President Obama, you know, would not be so depressed by what I've said. I think Mitch McConnell ought to be depressed, and I think Dean Reuter ought to be depressed. But, you know, Gene, that's the way it is.
Thank you.
No statutes are better than some statutes, however. Let's make no mistake about that. I could cite a few. There are a few controversial ones right now that are better than, would have been better than no statutes, and we desperately need to try to repeal.
But no statutes are also less good than executive orders, which are grabby, aggressive, and lawless.
Well, yes. If in fact the result inevitably is, you know, a lawless president, and I just don't believe that is the inevitable result of gridlock and paralysis among the political branches. That there are bad results, and those yield bad results, the paralysis does. But one of them should not be the death of the rule of law and a rogue president violating his oath of office promiscuously. That shouldn't be among the results that we have to expect, and therefore rush to pass something in order to prevent.
Yep. One key thing to remember, the comment about negotiations necessary for legislation. Because of his veto power, the president is inherently a party to that negotiation.
Yes, sir.
So you have to have the president be willing or realize he can accomplish his goals through that as compared to unilateral action, which was true of Bill Clinton, true of Ronald Reagan, true of Richard Nixon, true of many presidents where you saw a lot of significant legislation passed.
That's right. Absolutely.
Next question.
One of the things I didn't hear the panelists mention was the changes in our constitutional structure since the framers put it together, which many people blame for leading to this problem. One of the things most obviously pointed to is the change in election of senators, which took away the state check on the federal government's power. If we leave aside for just a second the difficulty of passing a constitutional amendment, I'm wondering if each of the panelists has one particular amendment that you think, if it could be passed, might help repair some of the cracks in the structure.
Interesting. Anyone want to go first? Favorite constitutional amendment?
I would, look, the academics are foolish or person of the fray. I don't know if this is worth a constitutional amendment. I would abolish the filibuster. I think the filibuster is very destructive. Now, that doesn't solve the problems in the House, but I think in the Senate, the filibuster has kept dozens of people off the judiciary, conservatives, liberals, et cetera. It slows down the Senate. If the House ever gets its act together again, the Senate will, they're like twin children. I don't know how many of you all have twins, but when you have twin children, when one of them acts up, the other one is well behaved. But if one of them starts behaving well, the other one starts acting up almost inevitably. And the House and the Senate seem to be like Tweedledee and Tweedledum along those lines. So I would do the filibuster.
As a House member who was always frustrated by the Senate, I still would appreciate the filibuster in spite of that enormous frustration. But we can have a long discussion about that.
That's what I would do.
Chuck.
Hans, I would refer you to a recent book by our old colleague and dear friend Mark Levin, who has a number of ideas on that very question. And I won't isolate on any particular one, but it will provide you with a lot of food for thought on that question.
Thank you. Naomi.
I'm not sure if it would be necessarily possible to draw an amendment like this or how to enforce it, but I think an amendment limiting excessive delegations would be a good one. But I don't know how that would necessarily be administered.
Thank you. Yes.
I guess sort of to go off what Professor Rao just said, it seems like a lot of the problems that we face in this area come down to defining what is legislative power versus what is executive power. And it certainly seems like the court has a lot of the difficulties in judicially enforcing some of the separation of powers concerns comes down to, the problems with intelligible principle, and the court sort of shying away from trying to assert what the differences between the two are. And I think that obviously provides a lot of justification for, President Obama and people who agree with him that if there's this giant gray area between executive and legislative authority, and you have, obviously, he's acted in ways that are, say clearly contrary to statute, but do you all agree that obviously trying to distinguish between executive and legislative authority is something that's a problem that we face, and do you have any suggestions as to how either courts could enforce that or Congress could try to assert what legislative authority is that the president can't usurp?
Naomi, you want to go first on that?
Well, I think there are difficulties with drawing a line between maybe not the legislative power and the executive power, but between the legislative function and the executive function. And I do think that's a difference. And in part, the problem is that the executive always has to interpret, right? They always have to fill in some gap, even in a specific statute, and that will sometimes look like an exercise of some kind of legislative function. And so it is very hard to draw the line, and that has been one of the reasons why the court has refused to enforce that line. I'm not sure how Congress can force a consideration about that except by filling in more of the details themselves, right? Maybe as Bill suggests, right, they have to pass more statutes, and then they will occupy that space. And if they do that, then there will just be less space for the executive to exercise discretion and make up the rules.
Chuck or Bill?
The problem that I've been trying to address is not produced by the gray area and the differences of opinion in terms of what constitutes an executive act or what constitutes a legislative act. I think Naomi has spoken to that, and yes, we've got a serious issue with Congress delegating to so-called independent agencies legislative powers, and therefore divorcing from accountability and the people as far as possible, the actual legislation that ultimately governs them. The independent agencies and their regulatory power and their lawmaking power vastly outstrip Congress, and that isn't how the framers expected things to unfold. But what I'm getting at are executive actions that have been in the teeth of what Congress has done, unambiguously has done, I would submit. and have effectively repealed or reversed or extended or ignored those things that are really quite unambiguous and that Congress has commanded on the one hand. And on the other, things that are quite clearly, in my opinion, excessive legislative acts in the face of Congress's explicit refusal to do that which this administration has urged it to do. It simply, in several cases, hasn't mattered that the Congress has entertained the legislative proposal, has debated it, and has rejected it. The president just does it unilaterally himself. This can't be explained as, kind of legitimate, reasonable disagreements about what is the president and what is Congress's. I believe these are simple violations of the rule of law.
I'm just, without really answering your question satisfactorily, I'd make this constitutional distinction. And I think the ship has sailed on both of them. I think what Naomi is talking about is it's very difficult to police now a boundary between legislative and executive power. The 1930s was the big battle over this. The court gave up on it, and there's no one on the court who's willing to fight this battle. And indeed, most lawmaking, and this is out of the closet, there's no secret about this is not some kind of academic conspiracy. Most avowed lawmaking is now done by agencies, usually through notice and comment procedures. I think the issue that Chuck is focusing on more is, but this is also hard to adjudicate, the meaning of the take care clause. So somewhat different than the executive legislative pole is the president is charged to take care to faithfully execute the laws, which obviously means mainly statutes, maybe treaties as well. And that's the beef there, though the whole point of this panel has been it's very difficult to cash in on that, right? It's very difficult to enforce that. And my thesis, which Gene has said is very depressing, is that the president has a lot of incentive and a lot of weapons in his arsenal to approach take care very flexibly and very self-interestedly. And that's what we're seeing. And I think we could continue to see it for a while.
And very, I should add, strategically.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at, you try to catalog all the things that might come within this complaint I am offering, you find, I think, carefully considered the question whether, if we do this, will it result in a direct injury to someone who can challenge it in court? And in case after case, it's very difficult to identify, at least obviously, a party that has been injured and can challenge the executive action in court. It's a very, and I think that is to be deplored as well.
Well, I have a question for Chuck then. Would you and Naomi support my view that standing doctrine ought to be, let's not use the word liberalized, but let's say constricted, because standing is an aggressive, expansive judicial activism under Article 3. Should that activism be trimmed back, which would allow more people to sue, particularly when executive agency, presidential people are doing harmful things, illegal things?
I am much more amenable to that argument than I used to be, I must confess.
Chuck, confession is good for the soul.
Right.
Amen. Amen, Brother Cooper. Sister Rao.
But I'm not taking a position.
Yeah, no, I have to say, I tend to like the standing doctrines of the court, but I see your arguments.
Maybe not so much.
No, but I see your arguments.
I think everybody in this room ought to rethink some of this.
I think you've given us a great topic for a future panel at a Federalist Society meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
With that, we've run out of time in the room. Literally, they've asked us to be able to clear out. The next session will begin in 15 minutes across the hall in the promenade room with Senator Ted Cruz. Thank you, panelists. Great effort.